This suicide note destroyed a daughter's world in 8 words. The prescriptions were killing them. I couldn't stop. Dr. Michael Hartwell, beloved for 30 years, trusted by 3 generations, found dead in his clinic. But here's what nobody saw coming. He wasn't the killer. Someone had been forcing him to murder elderly patients with medications. Someone who smiled at their funerals. His daughter Sarah thought she was investigating her father's crimes. Instead, she uncovered how her own grandmother was murdered, and who was really pulling the strings. The truth will make you question every prescription your loved ones take. Sarah Hartwell was pouring her morning coffee when her phone rang at 6:47 a.m. The voice on the other end was shaking, "Mrs. Peterson from the clinic. Sarah, you need to come now. It's your father." 20 minutes later, Sarah stood frozen in the doorway of her father's office. The same office where she'd gotten her childhood vaccines, where he'd bandaged her scraped knees. Now it felt like a tomb. Her father slumped over his mahogany desk, the one her mother had bought him for their anniversary 15 years ago. But it was the yellow sticky note that made her blood run cold. Written in her father's careful handwriting, the same script that had signed thousands of prescriptions, were words that made no sense. The prescriptions were killing them. I couldn't stop. Check my patient files, the elderly ones. Sarah, I'm so sorry. She read it again. Then again. The words swam before her eyes. Her father, who dedicated his life to healing, claiming he was killing people? With prescriptions? It was impossible. This was the man who'd driven through blizzards to deliver babies, who'd held her hand during her mother's cancer treatments. Sarah's fingers trembled as she opened the first patient file on his desk. Eleanor Martinez, 78 years old. 12 different medications. Antipsychotics, blood thinners, sleep aids, a cocktail that would make a pharmacist's head spin. Eleanor had died 3 months ago from what the family was told was natural decline. The next file, Robert Chin, 82. 15 medications. Dead from a fall that the family attributed to his worsening dementia. File after file, the pattern emerged like a nightmare coming into focus. Elderly patients. Excessive medications. Rapid mental decline. Deaths that seemed convenient. But here's what chilled Sarah to the bone. Every single prescription had been filled at Chen's pharmacy. Margaret Chin, the woman who'd brought casseroles when Sarah's mother was sick, who remembered every patient's birthday, who'd been like a second mother to half the town. Sarah sank into her father's chair, the leather still warm from where he'd been sitting hours before. What could drive a man who'd sworn to do no harm, to take his own life? What kind of pressure, what kind of threat could force someone to betray everything they believed in? She didn't know it yet, but she was about to discover that the most dangerous predators don't lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they wear white coats and kind smiles, and they've been watching you your entire life. To understand how impossible this seemed, you need to know who Dr. Michael Hartwell really was in Millbrook. This wasn't just any small-town doctor. This was a man who'd become a living legend. In 1989, when Michael first hung his shingle on Main Street, Millbrook was dying. The textile mill had closed, young people were fleeing to the cities, and the nearest hospital was 43 miles away. But Michael didn't just open a practice, he became the town's lifeline. There was the night in '94 when little Tommy Rodriguez stopped breathing during a severe asthma attack. The ambulance was stuck in a snowstorm, so Michael performed an emergency tracheotomy on his kitchen table while Tommy's mother held a flashlight. Tommy's now a paramedic himself, inspired by the man who saved his life. Or consider the Martinez family, 3 generations of patients. Michael delivered Maria Martinez in 1995, treated her mother's diabetes for 20 years, and was holding her grandmother's hand when she passed peacefully in 2018. He wasn't just our doctor, Maria would later say, he was family. The walls of his clinic told the story of a man who never gave up. There was the photo of him at the bedside of cancer patient Janet Walsh, who'd been given 3 months to live. Michael fought for experimental treatments, drove her to specialists in Boston, and celebrated when she went into remission. Janet lived another 8 years. His reputation spread beyond Millbrook's borders. Medical students would request rotations just to learn from him. The state medical board had honored him twice for rural healthcare excellence. In 2015, he'd been named Country Doctor of the Year by the American Academy of Family Physicians. But here's what made Michael truly special. He remembered everything. Not just medical histories but birthdays, anniversaries, the names of grandchildren. Mrs. Patterson's arthritis always flared before storms, so he'd call to check on her when the weather turned. He knew that Mr. Kowalski's blood pressure spiked during tax season, so he'd schedule extra visits in April. The man had delivered over 800 babies in 30 years. He'd guided families through cancer diagnoses, held vigil during heart attacks, and comforted the dying. His waiting room was filled with thank you cards, baby photos, and wedding invitations from patients who considered him part of their families. So when Sarah sat in that office, staring at files that suggested her father was systematically killing elderly patients, it felt like discovering that Mother Teresa was a serial killer. Everything she knew about the man who'd raised her, everything the town believed about their beloved doctor, was crashing down around her. But the most terrifying question was just beginning to form in her mind. If someone could force a man like Michael Hartwell to become a killer, what kind of monster were they dealing with? Sarah spent the next 3 days locked in her father's office, and what she found made her question everything she thought she knew about medicine, aging, and death itself. The pattern was so subtle, so perfectly disguised, that it had fooled everyone, including trained medical professionals. It started with patients over 75, usually those living alone or with minimal family oversight. The initial complaints were always innocent: trouble sleeping, mild anxiety, occasional confusion. But then came the prescriptions. Not one or two medications, cascades of them. A sleep aid would be prescribed, then an antipsychotic for agitation, then a blood thinner because the antipsychotic increased fall risk, then a medication for the nausea caused by the blood thinner. Each prescription seemed logical in isolation, but together they created a pharmaceutical nightmare. Take Dorothy Williams, 79. She'd come in complaining of occasional sleeplessness after her husband's death, completely normal grief. Within 6 months she was on 9 different medications. Her daughter later described watching her mother transform from a sharp, independent woman into someone who couldn't remember her own address. The doctor said it was just her age catching up with her, the daughter had told the family. Dorothy died from a fall 8 months later. Or Frank Morrison, 81, a retired mechanic who could still rebuild an engine from memory. His crime? Mentioning to Dr. Hartwell that he felt a bit down after his dog died. Soon he was on antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and sleep aids. His nephew found him 3 months later, dead from what appeared to be accidental overdose. "We thought it was dementia," the nephew said. "The pharmacist told us it happens fast sometimes." But here's what made Sarah's blood run cold. Every single family had been told the same thing. It's natural aging. Sometimes decline happens quickly. At least he's not suffering anymore. The families weren't just accepting these explanations, they were grateful for them. It gave them permission to stop fighting, to let go. The most disturbing discovery came when Sarah noticed the psychiatric medications. Why were so many elderly patients being prescribed antipsychotics? These were powerful drugs designed for severe mental illness, not the mild anxiety or sleep issues documented in the files. She pulled up the medical literature on her laptop. What she read made her stomach drop. Antipsychotics in elderly patients increased the risk of falls, strokes, and sudden death by up to 60%. The FDA had issued black box warnings. Every doctor knew this. So why was her father, a careful, conservative physician, prescribing them like candy? Sarah leaned back in her father's chair, a terrible realization creeping over her. This wasn't medical malpractice. This wasn't even negligence. The precision, the systematic nature, the perfect cover stories, this was something far more sinister. Someone had turned her father into a weapon. But who? And how do you force a good man to become a killer? Every prescription had one thing in common: they were all filled at Chen's pharmacy. Margaret Chen, the woman Sarah had known since childhood, who'd given her lollipops after doctor visits and remembered everyone's allergies by heart. Margaret had been Millbrook's only pharmacist for 20 years. She'd moved to town the same year Sarah graduated high school, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s who quickly became as trusted as Dr. Hartwell himself. Patients loved her because she took time to explain medications, called to check on side effects, and even delivered prescriptions to homebound elderly patients. The relationship between Margaret and Dr. Hartwell seemed perfect, two medical professionals working seamlessly together. Margaret would often call with suggestions about drug interactions or alternative medications. She'd even attend medical conferences with him, always eager to learn about new treatments for their aging patient population. But as Sarah stared at the prescription patterns, a chilling thought began to form. Margaret wasn't just filling these dangerous combinations, she was the one who had access to every patient's complete medication history. She knew exactly which drugs would interact, which doses would be lethal, which patients were most vulnerable. Sarah was about to discover that Margaret Chen wasn't just filling prescriptions. She was writing the playbook for medical murder. The truth about Margaret Chen's hold over Dr. Hartwell was hidden in a manila folder buried deep in his personal safe. Sarah almost missed it. Tucked behind insurance papers and old tax returns was a file labeled simply, Rebecca Morrison 1987. Rebecca Morrison. Sarah had never heard the name, but as she read the medical records, her father's careful handwriting told a story of catastrophic failure. Rebecca, just 23 years old, had come to the emergency room where Michael was completing his residency. Severe abdominal pain, nausea, elevated white blood cell count, textbook appendicitis. But Michael, exhausted after a 36-hour shift, misread the CT scan. He sent Rebecca home with pain medication and instructions to rest. Rebecca Morrison died 12 hours later from a ruptured appendix and septic shock. The cover-up was swift and thorough. Michael altered the medical records, changed timestamps, and convinced the radiologist to reinterpret the CT scan. Rebecca's family, devastated and trusting, never questioned the revised story that her appendix had been impossible to detect, until it was too late. The case never went to court. Michael's career was saved. But someone had been watching. Margaret Chen wasn't just any pharmacist who'd stumbled into Millbrook. She was Rebecca Morrison's older sister, and she'd spent 15 years planning her revenge. From Margaret's perspective, the plan was beautiful in its simplicity. She'd studied Michael's career, learned his patterns, his weaknesses, his desperate need to be seen as perfect. She'd moved to Millbrook not for a fresh start, but for a front-row seat to his destruction. Margaret kept meticulous records, not just of prescriptions, but of every mistake Michael made. A missed drug interaction here, a slightly elevated dosage there, moments of fatigue when his judgment slipped. She photographed prescription pads, recorded phone conversations, documented every instance where Michael's care fell short of perfection. Her apartment, investigators would later discover, was a shrine to systematic documentation. Filing cabinets lined every wall, each drawer labeled by year and patient name. She had photographs of Michael at medical conferences, copies of his medical school transcripts, even his mother's obituary. She knew his schedule better than his own secretary. The blackmail began subtly in 2010. A casual mention of Rebecca Morrison's name during a routine prescription consultation. Michael's face went white. Margaret smiled and said nothing more, but the message was clear. She knew. From that moment, Margaret owned him. She would call with suggestions for elderly patients. Perhaps Mr. Johnson needed something stronger for his anxiety? Maybe Mrs. Patterson's sleep issues required a more aggressive approach? Each suggestion came with the unspoken threat: comply or Rebecca Morrison's family learns the truth about their daughter's death. Margaret had turned patience into a weapon, kindness into a mask, and trust into a tool for murder. She wasn't just filling prescriptions, she was conducting a 15-year symphony of revenge, with Michael as her unwilling instrument and Millbrook's elderly as her victims. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake that would bring her entire operation crashing down. Margaret's revenge wasn't just about destroying Michael Hartwell, it was about profiting from every death along the way. What Sarah discovered next revealed a pharmaceutical killing machine so sophisticated, it had been generating millions in illegal profits while flying completely under the radar. The scheme worked like a deadly assembly line. Margaret would identify vulnerable elderly patients, those with minimal family oversight, mild cognitive issues, or recent losses that made them emotionally fragile. She'd then orchestrate their medical appointments, calling Michael with concerns about their mental state. Here's how the money flowed. Medicare and private insurance companies pay pharmacies significantly more for psychiatric medications than standard drugs. A month's supply of generic blood pressure medication might net the pharmacy $12. But antipsychotics? Mood stabilizers? Sleep aids? Those same 30 pills could generate $300 in profit. Margaret had turned grief into gold. Every confused elderly patient represented a potential windfall, and she'd perfected the art of pharmaceutical multiplication. One sleeping pill prescription would require an anti-anxiety medication for daytime drowsiness. That would necessitate a mood stabilizer for emotional regulation, which would demand a blood thinner for increased stroke risk. Each addition exponentially increased both the danger and the profit. But the real genius was in the drug combinations themselves. Margaret didn't just pick random medications, she selected specific cocktails that would create a cascade of symptoms that mimicked natural aging. Take the case of Harold Peterson, 76, a retired teacher who came in complaining of mild insomnia after his wife's death. Within 2 months, Harold was on a lethal combination: Seroquel for sleep, Ativan for anxiety, Coumadin for blood clotting, and Aricept for early cognitive decline. This combination is a pharmacological nightmare. The Seroquel and Ativan together increase fall risk by 400%, while the Coumadin ensures that any fall becomes potentially fatal. Harold's daughter watched her sharp, independent father transform into a confused, shuffling shadow of himself. When he fell and hit his head 3 months later, bleeding to death from what should have been a minor injury, the family was told it was just one of those tragic accidents that happen with aging. Or consider Martha Williams, 82, whose only complaint was feeling a bit sad during the holidays. Margaret's prescription cocktail included Haldol, Ambien, and warfarin, a combination so dangerous that most pharmacists would refuse to fill it. Martha began experiencing hallucinations within weeks, convinced that people were breaking into her house. When she called 911 repeatedly, her family was told it was sundown syndrome. Martha died from a medication-induced seizure 6 weeks later. The most heartbreaking case was Thomas Chin, no relation to Margaret, despite sharing her surname. Thomas, 79, was a Korean War veteran who'd survived combat only to be slowly murdered by the very medications meant to help him. His treatment for mild depression included 5 different psychiatric drugs that, when combined, essentially pickled his brain. His son later described watching his war hero father become so confused he couldn't remember how to use a fork. Have you ever questioned why your elderly relative was on so many medications? Have you wondered why grandma suddenly couldn't remember your name, or why grandpa started falling so frequently? Margaret Chin was counting on families to accept these changes as natural aging, and for 15 years they did. The insurance companies never questioned the prescriptions because they came from a respected rural doctor. The families never questioned the decline because a trusted pharmacist explained it was normal. And the patients? They trusted the very people who were slowly killing them. But Margaret's greed would ultimately expose her. Because when you're generating millions in illegal profits, someone eventually notices the money trail. Margaret Chin had mastered the art of gaslighting entire families, and her weapon of choice was something every adult fears: watching their parents age. The brilliance of her cover wasn't just medical, it was psychological. Margaret understood that adult children are primed to expect decline in their elderly parents. When 78-year-old Robert Martinez started forgetting his grandson's name, his daughter Maria didn't suspect medication side effects. She suspected time. Margaret would position herself as the caring expert who helped families understand their new reality. When Maria called the pharmacy worried about her father's sudden confusion, Margaret's voice was warm and reassuring. "Oh honey, I see this all the time. Sometimes the mind just slips away faster than we'd like. But Dr. Hartwell is keeping him comfortable, and that's what matters now." She had a script for every symptom. False balance issues are so common at his age. Hallucinations? Sometimes the mind creates its own reality when it's struggling. Sudden personality changes? The brain changes as we get older, dear. He's still your father, just different now. But Margaret's most insidious tool was comparison. She'd casually mention other patients during conversations. "You know, Mrs. Patterson went through the same thing with her husband. One day he was fine, the next he couldn't remember how to tie his shoes. It happens so fast sometimes." These weren't random examples, they were other victims, used as proof that rapid decline was normal. The trust factor was Margaret's greatest asset. In small towns, pharmacists occupy a unique position of authority. They're more accessible than doctors, more knowledgeable than nurses, and they see patients more frequently than anyone else in the medical system. When Margaret spoke, families listened. She'd built her reputation carefully over 20 years. Margaret remembered birthdays, asked about grandchildren, and genuinely seemed to care about every patient's well-being. She'd even attend funerals, comforting grieving families with gentle words about how their loved one was finally at peace and no longer suffering. The prescription records tell a chilling story when viewed chronologically. Patient after patient followed the same trajectory. Initial complaint, rapid medication escalation, cognitive decline, family acceptance, death. The timeline was so consistent it looked like a manufacturing process. Insurance claims revealed the financial pattern. Margaret's pharmacy was billing for psychiatric medications at rates 400% higher than comparable rural pharmacies. But because the prescriptions came from a respected doctor and the patients were elderly, no red flags were raised. The most damning evidence was Margaret's own documentation. She kept detailed notes on family dynamics, identifying which relatives were most likely to question treatment and which would accept her explanations. She had psychological profiles on dozens of families, noting things like daughter lives out of state, visits monthly, or son feels guilty about nursing home, won't question care. Margaret Chin had weaponized compassion itself. She turned families' love for their elderly relatives into a tool for murder, convincing them that watching their parents die slowly was an act of mercy. But she was about to discover that some secrets are too big to stay buried. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for the file she'd been avoiding all week. The tab read Rose Hartwell, her own grandmother, the woman who'd raised her after her mother died, who'd taught her to bake cookies and told her bedtime stories about brave princesses. Grandma Rose had lived independently until age 83, sharp as a tack and stubborn as a mule. Sarah remembered their last real conversation, Rose complaining about trouble sleeping since moving to the senior apartment complex. "Just need something to help me rest, sweetheart. All those new sounds keep me up." The file told a different story. Within 6 weeks of that complaint, Rose was on 4 psychiatric medications. Seroquel for sleep, Risperdal for agitation, Ativan for anxiety, Depakote for mood stabilization. Sarah stared at the prescriptions in horror. Her grandmother had never shown signs of mental illness in her entire life. But the medical notes painted a picture of rapid decline. Patient increasingly confused and combative. Daughter reports personality changes and memory loss. Recommend increased psychiatric intervention for advancing dementia. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She remembered those final months, watching her vibrant grandmother transform into a confused, frightened stranger. Rose would call at 3 a.m., convinced strangers were in her apartment. She'd forget Sarah's name, then remember it an hour later. She'd become paranoid, accusing nurses of stealing her jewelry. The family had been told it was sundown syndrome, a common form of dementia that progressed rapidly in some patients. Margaret Chin had personally delivered Rose's medications, sitting with the family to explain how the drugs would keep her comfortable during her decline. Sarah now realized she'd watched her grandmother being slowly poisoned. Every confused phone call, every moment Rose didn't recognize her, every frightened look in her eyes, it wasn't dementia. It was drug-induced psychosis. The worst part? Sarah had been grateful when Rose finally died. Grateful that her suffering was over, grateful that the disease had finally claimed her. She'd even thanked Margaret Chen at the funeral for being so caring during Rose's final months. Margaret had murdered Sarah's grandmother and convinced Sarah to thank her for it. But as Sarah sat there, tears streaming down her face, she noticed something that made her heart race. At the bottom of Rose's file was a handwritten note in Margaret's distinctive script. Patient's granddaughter asking too many questions about medications. Recommend accelerated timeline. Margaret Chin had made one crucial mistake that would bring her entire operation crashing down. Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed the FBI's healthcare fraud hotline at 2:17 a.m. The agent who answered probably expected another routine tip about billing irregularities. Instead, Sarah's voice cut through the darkness. "I have evidence of a pharmacist who's been murdering elderly patients for 15 years, and I think my father killed himself to stop her." Within 48 hours, Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez was sitting in Dr. Hartwell's office, staring at the same files that had shattered Sarah's world. Rodriguez had investigated healthcare fraud for 12 years, but she'd never seen anything this systematic, this coldly calculated. "This isn't just fraud," Rodriguez told her team during their first briefing. "This is serial murder disguised as medical care." The FBI's investigation moved with surgical precision. Financial analysts traced the money flow through Margaret's pharmacy, discovering a web of kickbacks and inflated billing that had generated over $4.2 million in illegal profits. Insurance investigators found that Chen's pharmacy was billing for psychiatric medications at rates that defied statistical probability, unless you were deliberately targeting vulnerable patients. But the real breakthrough came when they obtained Margaret's personal computers. What they found was a digital monument to obsession and revenge. Spreadsheets tracking every patient's medication regimen, profit margins calculated to the penny, and most damning of all, detailed psychological profiles of victims and their families. Margaret had rated families on their likelihood to question treatment. She documented which relatives lived out of state, which ones felt guilty about nursing home placements, and which ones would be most susceptible to her natural aging explanations. It was a predator's playbook refined over decades. The exhumation orders came next. 12 bodies were disinterred from Millbrook Cemetery, including Rose Hartwell. The toxicology reports painted a horrifying picture, lethal combinations of psychiatric drugs and concentrations that would have caused hallucinations, seizures, and organ failure. Harold Peterson's remains showed Seroquel levels 5 times the therapeutic dose. Martha Williams had enough Haldol in her system to tranquilize a horse. Thomas Chen's body contained a cocktail of psychiatric drugs that would have left him in a constant state of chemical restraint. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, Margaret's own meticulous record-keeping. Investigators found a hidden safe in her basement containing what she called her insurance files. These weren't medical records, they were blackmail materials. Photographs of Dr. Hartwell at medical conferences, looking exhausted and making minor errors. Recordings of phone conversations where his judgment seemed impaired. Copies of the original Rebecca Morrison file, annotated with Margaret's handwriting. Leverage used sparingly. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Dr. Hartwell's suicide. Margaret was at her pharmacy, calmly filling prescriptions and chatting with elderly customers about their grandchildren, when FBI agents walked through the door. Witnesses described the moment as surreal. Margaret, who'd spent 20 years perfecting her mask of caring concern, simply smiled and said, "I wondered when you'd figure it out." No denial, no surprise, just the calm satisfaction of someone whose long game had finally been revealed. The evidence seized from her pharmacy filled 3 FBI trucks. Prescription records dating back 15 years, financial documents showing the flow of illegal profits, and most chilling of all, a leather-bound journal where Margaret had documented each victim's decline with clinical detachment. Day 23, patient showing increased confusion. Family accepting dementia explanation. Increased Risperdal dosage. Day 45, daughter questioning rapid decline. Reassured her this is normal progression. Patient likely has 2 to 3 weeks remaining. Day 67, patient deceased. Family grateful for compassionate care. Funeral attendants recommended to maintain cover. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, she turned to Agent Rodriguez with a smile that chilled everyone present. "You have no idea how many of us are out there," she said quietly. "How many Margaret Chens are filling prescriptions in small towns across America, waiting for the right opportunity." The investigation had uncovered one monster, but Margaret's final words suggested something far more terrifying, that she might not be alone. The trial of Margaret Chen began 6 months later, and what emerged in that courtroom would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Maria Martinez took the stand first, her voice breaking as she described watching her father Robert transform from a vibrant man into a confused shell. "She told me it was normal," Maria testified, staring directly at Margaret. "She said I should be grateful he wasn't suffering. But he was suffering every single day and I helped her do it to him." One by one, family members testified about the same pattern. The gentle decline that wasn't gentle at all. The reassuring phone calls from Margaret that kept them from questioning the treatment. The gratitude they'd felt when their loved ones finally died. Margaret's defense strategy was as calculated as her crimes. Her attorney painted her as a grieving sister driven to madness by her own loss, a woman who'd snapped under the weight of watching her sister's killer live a celebrated life. They argued that Dr. Hartwell was the real mastermind, using Margaret as a scapegoat for his own greed. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed Margaret had personally profited from 127 deaths over 15 years, generating $4.2 million in fraudulent insurance claims. The victims ranged in age from 67 to 94, with an average survival time of just 73 days after beginning Margaret's treatment protocols. The most devastating testimony came from Dr. Hartwell's medical assistant, who revealed his final desperate attempt to stop the scheme. In his last weeks, Michael had begun secretly reducing dosages and substituting placebos for the most dangerous medications. He'd started calling families directly, suggesting they seek second opinions for their elderly relatives. Margaret had discovered his rebellion through her network of contacts at the pharmacy. The night before his suicide, she'd confronted him with evidence of his sabotage and threatened to expose not just the Rebecca Morrison cover-up, but also his recent malpractice in altering her prescribed treatments. She told him he had 2 choices, the assistant testified. Continue killing patients or watch his reputation, his family, and his freedom disappear. She said she'd make sure Sarah knew exactly what kind of man her father really was. Michael Hartwell's final act wasn't just suicide, it was the only way he could think of to stop Margaret without destroying his daughter's life. His death was meant to be his confession, his evidence, and his redemption all at once. But Margaret had underestimated Sarah's determination to uncover the truth. The judge's words echoed through the packed courtroom. Margaret Chin, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 127 counts of first-degree murder. But for the families of Millbrook, no sentence could undo the damage she'd inflicted on their community's soul. Margaret showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Even in handcuffs, she maintained the same calm demeanor that had fooled an entire town for 2 decades. As she was led away, she turned to the gallery one final time and mouthed words that chilled everyone present. "You'll never catch them all." The ripple effects of Margaret's crimes transformed how America monitors prescription drugs. The Hartwell Protocol now requires real-time tracking of psychiatric medications prescribed to elderly patients, with automatic flags for dangerous combinations. Pharmacies must now report unusual prescribing patterns within 48 hours, and insurance companies employ AI systems to detect the kind of systematic overprescribing that Margaret had perfected. But in Millbrook, the changes ran deeper than policy. Families began questioning every medication their elderly relatives took. The town's trust in medical professionals was shattered. Pharmacy visits became tense affairs, with relatives demanding detailed explanations for every prescription. 3 elderly patients died that winter after refusing medications they actually needed, too terrified to trust any medical advice. Sarah Hartwell channeled her grief into action, founding the National Coalition for Elderly Prescription Safety. Her organization has identified 12 other cases across the country where pharmacists or doctors systematically targeted vulnerable elderly patients. Margaret wasn't unique, Sarah tells audiences at her speaking engagements. She was just the first one we caught. The most haunting discovery came during the cleanup of Margaret's apartment. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators found detailed files on pharmacists in 17 other states, colleagues she'd met at conferences, corresponded with online, and shared strategies for maximizing profits from elderly patients. Margaret Chen's network was larger than anyone had imagined. Her arrest had exposed one tentacle of what appeared to be a nationwide conspiracy of medical predators, each operating in their own small communities, each perfecting their own methods of turning trust into murder. The question that keeps Sarah awake at night isn't whether Margaret will ever be released, it's how many other Margaret Chens are still out there, filling prescriptions and attending funerals. Tonight, as you're watching this, there are approximately 67,000 independent pharmacies across America. In small towns just like Millbrook, trusted pharmacists are filling prescriptions for elderly patients who see them as family. The terrifying question isn't whether another Margaret Chen exists. It's how many are operating right now, hiding behind white coats and kind smiles. Consider this. Margaret's scheme worked for 15 years in a town where everyone knew everyone. She attended church with her victims, brought casseroles to their families and comforted them at funerals. If someone that integrated into a community could systematically murder 127 people without detection, what does that say about our ability to protect the most vulnerable among us? The elderly are perfect targets for medical predators. They take multiple medications, often have mild cognitive issues that mask drug-induced symptoms, and their families are primed to expect decline. When 82-year-old grandpa starts falling more frequently, do you question his medications or do you accept that he's just getting old? We place extraordinary trust in medical professionals, and that trust is usually well-founded. But Margaret Chin understood that trust could be weaponized. She knew that families would believe a pharmacist over their own instincts, that insurance companies would pay without question, and that elderly deaths in small towns rarely trigger investigations. Sarah Hartwell's organization has identified patterns in 12 other communities that mirror Millbrook's experience. Unusually high rates of psychiatric medication prescribing to elderly patients. Pharmacies with profit margins that defy explanation. Families who describe watching their loved ones decline rapidly after starting new medications. But here's what should terrify you most. Margaret's hidden files contained correspondence with pharmacists in 17 states. She wasn't working alone, she was part of a network, sharing strategies and celebrating successes. Her arrest may have stopped one killer, but it exposed evidence of a much larger conspiracy. The next time you visit an elderly relative who seems confused or has started falling frequently, ask yourself, are these the natural effects of aging, or could someone be slowly poisoning them for profit? Because somewhere in America tonight, another Margaret Chin is filling prescriptions, attending community events and planning her next victim. The question isn't if they exist, it's whether we'll catch them before they kill again. Dr. Michael Hartwell spent his final years trapped between his oath to do no harm and a blackmailer who forced him to do exactly that. His suicide wasn't just an escape, it was his final act of rebellion against a system that had corrupted everything he believed in. Margaret Chin is serving life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. But the question remains, in your community, who's really watching the watchers? If you have elderly relatives or friends, please check their medications. Ask questions about new prescriptions, especially psychiatric drugs. If someone who was sharp suddenly becomes confused after starting new medications, don't just accept that it's natural aging. Trust your instincts. I've put links in the description to prescription safety resources and warning signs to watch for. The National Coalition for Elderly Prescription Safety, founded by Sarah Hartwell, has tools to help you advocate for your loved ones. Have you ever witnessed rapid decline in an elderly relative that seems suspicious? Have you questioned a pharmacist's explanations about medications? Share your experiences in the comments. Your story might help someone else recognize the warning signs. And if this case has shown you anything, it's that the most dangerous predators often hide in plain sight, wearing the uniforms we trust most. Subscribe for more investigations into the crimes that happen in places we thought were safe, committed by people we thought we could trust. Because the truth is, Margaret Chin was right about one thing: there are others out there. The question is, will we find them before they find their next victim?